The thought of your computer getting a virus implies something biological, but the fear of infection is real. Are there prevention techniques you need to be implementing now? Today's guest is Ran Levi. Ran has been podcasting since 2007 and started with a podcast regarding history and technology. He's the co-founder of PI Media LTD, helping other people do podcasts. He is the editor and host of the popular podcast Malicious Life that tells the stories of the histories of cybersecurity with commentary by hackers, security experts, journalists, and politicians. I'm your host, Chris Parker, and this is the Easy Prey Podcast. Ran, thank you so much for coming on the Easy Prey Podcast today.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
So can you tell me and the audience a little bit about yourself and how you launched your podcast?
So I'm a podcaster from Israel. My name is Ran Levi. And about 15, coming up on 16 years ago, I started a podcast in Israel about history and technology. I'm an engineer by trade. I was, for like 15 years, I was an engineer, but writing and spreading knowledge was always my passion from a young age. So I started a podcast back when nobody knew what a podcast is, just because it was fun to do. And it took off. And about 6 years ago, I quit my day job as an engineer and started a company about, producing podcasts back when podcasting were virtually unknown in Israel. And about a year after I started my company, I got a phone call from Cybereason, an Israeli-American cybersecurity company. And their founders were listening to my Hebrew language show, the history show in Hebrew in Israel. And they asked me if I can create a show in the same narrative style about cybersecurity. And what do you know? 5 years earlier, I wrote my third book about the history of cybersecurity, which was one of my favorite topics because it kind of blends technology and psychology, two of my favorite topics. And I said to them, you know what? Yeah, let's try, because I had some reservations if I'll be able to do that in the kind of professional way I wanted to do my podcast. I'm a perfectionist. That's a curse and a blessing always. And quite early on, I realized that my accent wasn't good enough back then. So I took some 3 months or 4 months even and started improving my accent, exercising each day in front of the computer, saying tongue twisters and all that kind of stuff. And once I thought my accent improved in a measurable way, we started the show, and it's been one hell of a ride, as they say. It really, within, I think, half a year or a year, it rocketed. And I think that last month we were number 9 on iTunes technology podcast category, which is, for an Israeli guy whose English is his second language, is like playing in the NBA, I think.
That is definitely an accomplishment.
Thank you.
So can you tell me more about why the kind of the psychology and technology element is interesting to you?
Sure. As I said, it started with my book. I already wrote 2 books about the history of science and technology on various topics. And I was looking for, an interesting topic to write the third book. And I always, even on when I'm writing books or podcasts or whatever, I'm always looking for great stories. The story is always a crucial element in a good episode. There's the knowledge, that you want to give the audience some knowledge that they can use or enjoy and learn something new. But there has to be an interesting story involved. And I was trying to think of what fields in technology, what kind of ideas have great stories in them. And I started looking at different directions just for, trying to look for different ideas. And then I came across, I think it was Security Now with Steve Gibson, which you think interviewed for this podcast as well.
Yes, I have. He's a great guy, and I found out he lives
amazing
right down the street from me.
Amazing. And I started listening to Security Now, and I was hooked. I mean, as a programmer and a hardware engineer, I knew a bit about cybersecurity and about how to write code securely and stuff, but really only the basics. And I had no idea about the history of cybersecurity. And as a kid, copying, pirating games in Israel back in the 80s and 90s was quite, I would say, normal to pirate games because we didn't have a good software industry in Israel back then. And of course, I got lots of viruses back then. The ping pong virus, all sorts of stuff. I think the worst one was probably Sasser, the virus that tries to shut down your computer every 60 seconds. Was a hassle to debug. Rebooting the machine like 100 times in a row, something like that. And after listening to Security Now, I said to myself, this is a very interesting topic. I should really dive into it. And once I started learning the history and the ideas behind cybersecurity, I was even more hooked than I was before because I think that for many people, us in the cybersecurity business, we're kind of used to the idea of a sort of autonomous software running on our machine, doing stuff that we can't control. But I think for the public at large, that's a very weird idea. It's a machine. What do you mean it does what it wants? Back then, when I was, talking to people about viruses and worms and stuff, many people, it blew their minds that software can replicate itself, that it can do stuff autonomously, that it can resist attempts at debugging or reverse engineering itself, etc. So there is a kind of dread, I think, from the general public about the idea that something can infect your computer and have no idea what it does there.
Yeah.
And that mindset, I think, is in the heart of cybersecurity. Lots of stories. The idea that you have a machine that you interact with, it's the important part of everybody's lives. Our phones, our desktops, at work, at home. Yet something can happen which makes that machine turn against you in a way. And there's fear, very, very basic fear, I think, underlying the whole industry. And that fear...
A little bit of the fear of the unknown.
Exactly. Of something, quote unquote, living in your computer. Something is almost alive. You feel it's a virus. Is it a real virus? People who are not in the industry, they don't understand sometimes the basic ideas that we're talking about. Because, when you use the word virus, it has a connotation of biological creatures, worms. It's everything. It's the words we use to describe things are sometimes hint at something biological in nature, which is not. But the ideas are very, very interesting. So I started digging into the deep past of cybersecurity, back even to the 50s and 60s, interviewed the people who wrote the very first viruses, who discovered the very first viruses, the people who wrote the very first antiviruses, back when people were amazed that one of the most interesting things that I discovered in my research is there was a Scientific American, the magazine. They had a column, a very famous column about math puzzles. I think it was one of the last pages of every magazine, every one of them. And at one point, somebody sent a letter to the editor and said something about discovering a way to how he discovered a way to create artificial life inside of a computer. We're talking about 1978, I think, or 79, really, really early. Or maybe it was the early 80s. I forgot. And, in the next column, the writer, described the idea of creating artificial life and how it could be. And then in the following months, he got a deluge of letters from readers, each one of them describing how he reinvented a virus, because the idea of creating a self-replicating software seems to be very hard, but in essence, it's not that difficult. People have rediscovered how to create computer viruses at least a few hundred times in the past 50, 40 years. And lots of the people who discovered the idea were so afraid of that they've created a monster. I mean, there's an interesting story about it, a letter that a couple of Italian guys sent to that magazine about when they wrote a virus, they understood that it could spread out of control. So they burned the disks, the floppy disks, and they dismantled the computer so that no one will ever discover this idea again. And of course, it was discovered probably in parallel by 100 more people at the same time. So it's a very interesting topic. I mean, the psychology, questions of trust, of privacy, of fear of information leaking, which is sensitive, or, the greed of people who try to use cyber attacks to earn money and stuff. Ransomware is a great example of using fear in terms of the user interface. I mean, when we're, as software developers, create software interface, we usually try to make it nice, to make it pleasurable to use the software. But when you think about ransomware, they display, like when they encrypt the user's computer, they always display these scary images, a lock, blood. Sometimes there is even like weird noises and stuff because they want to make you feel afraid that you'll end up paying the ransom. So computers and emotions, that's a very interesting intersection.
Yeah. And these days, software engineers have definitely learned how to manipulate our emotions to a great degree.
Exactly.
So what have been some of your favorite topics or stories or episodes to tell?
Let's see. I mean, it's very difficult to decide.
They're all your children. Exactly.
I mean, probably one of my most favorite was the Ashley Madison hack. Sex and money and fear, and I mean, it's basically a great story. The right elements kind of joined together. Some of the stories I love are, I think, not very well known. For example, there's the story of Blue Frog. Blue Frog was an Israeli, I think, company back in the early 2000s, I think it was, which tried to fight spam by spamming the spammers, like returning the favor, as they say. But an interesting story, technologically wise, how they started, etc. Except one of the spammers was probably hit so hard, he decided he'll end the company literally. So they started harassing them. We're talking about a Russian spammer who started harassing the Israeli founders in Israel by sending them what we think are, private detectives or hitmen or whatever it is. I mean, it's a very scary story. It starts fun, and it gets darker and darker. That's why I love it so much. I love dark stories.
I think that is everybody's, one of the, gosh, I don't know if it's the anonymity is kind of one of the benefits of the internet. And I'm going to put anonymity in quotes because,
exactly.
Probably
nobody's
not.
really anonymous. Yeah.
But I think everybody's fear is like, oh, I could say things online that I would never be able to say in person, or do things online that I'd never do in person. As soon as someone shows up at your front door, it becomes very real very quickly.
Exactly. That's why I love what Brian Kerbs does on his website, on his blog, Kerbs on Security. Every other week or something like that, he publishes like a research that he does and masking or doxing the spammers and hackers just by silly mistakes that they make, like registering different services with the same email. And you think to yourself, well, I mean, these guys, they know the price they're going to pay, and they still make mistakes. And it makes you think about all the regular people. I mean, everybody makes mistakes online. If the spammers are making mistakes, the hackers, so what chance do the regular people have?
Yeah. Is there a favorite guest you've interviewed?
We interviewed a lot of people over the years, probably hundreds. One of my favorite, I mean, even on a personal level, I interviewed Steve Wozniak.
Oh, wow.
Apple's co-founder. Yeah, I mean, it was a cybersecurity conference. I think it was organized by Cyberism itself back then. And I had the pleasure of interviewing him on stage, talking about his, about how Apple thought about security back in the 70s. Spoiler, they didn't. Nobody thought about security. Exactly. But Wozniak he's a prankster. I mean, that's what he does. He pranked the Pope. He pranked everybody. That's what he does. Some of his pranks kind of crossed the line into virus. So he actually wrote a virus for the Apple II computer. And like everybody else, he understood what was going on. So he just deleted it and never talked about it again. It was very interesting to speak to the man. I mean, he's one of my heroes as an engineer. He's an absolute hero for me. We had lots of interesting guests. I mean, so difficult. Let's see, who are the other people that I interviewed? There was the Loft Industries. There were a gang that operated in the 90s. One of the very, very, very early cybersecurity pioneers. And I got to interview them, all of them, most of them at some point. Yeah, and it was very interesting to learn how things were going in the early 90s. I mean, nobody knew what they were doing. And when they discovered flaws in Microsoft's Windows back then, Microsoft totally ignored them.
Yeah.
And these grassroots stories are always very interesting. There
were no open bounty programs, no responsible disclosure programs.
Plus, their story is very interesting because at some point they decided to go the commercial route. I mean, they started as like hackers for fun. And at some point they decided to sell the company, and they became corporate, which kind of ruined everything for everybody. There was a kind of, some people who were more commercial, doing more commercial stuff. Some people who still had the ethics of, white hat hackers who work for fun. These things, they never go along best. So they had to fire some of their own friends from the new company. And it ended like on a sour note, but it's fun to see that 20 years after that, they're still friends. And they talk about, amazing, incidents that they had, like when they had to testify in Congress about a certain incident, about how unsecure the internet is, etc. And they took a wrong turn. They had like a big pickup truck or something. It was a big van, I think. And they took the wrong turn, and they ended up in the NSA's headquarters for some reason, in a van full of electronic equipment and antennas. They're very lucky to still be out of jail. It's a fun story. Yeah.
I'll definitely have to listen to that one. So was there any kind of incident that you did an episode on that was kind of like the most alarming, like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that this was compromised, or how close the world was to ending?
Interesting question. I don't know if there's a single story. I mean, Equifax, the Equifax affair was very alarming. I mean, I'm not a U.S. citizen, so I don't have like a credit history and credit score. That's something that is unique, I think, to the States. But knowing that everybody in the U.S. is under some sort of surveillance, that's basically what Equifax did. It gathered information about everyone. That was very surprising to me. That kind of like mass scale surveillance of this sort is legitimate. Yeah. And because I'm not familiar with something like that from Israel, that was a big surprise to me. And also, I had the pleasure of interviewing some security scientists, people who research, the basic stuff. And these interviews I very much like because they give you a glimpse about the future of cybersecurity. Not everything really, comes around and really becomes a product or whatever. But, for example, analyzing, characteristics, human characteristics from the way people write text in consoles, like shell text, and using, AI in defense and offense. That is real scary. I mean, AI, I know from other things that I read about AI, that AI has tremendous potential. And I think we haven't seen it still in cybersecurity to really, real potential coming to fruition. Once we will, that will be very interesting because you can think about all the, the latest generation of AI like DALL-E 2 and GPT-3, the kind of AI which can really, really imitate human interactions, human texts, images, whatever. Imagine communicating with somebody online, thinking that it's a human, and getting robbed or scammed by a machine. That's something that is so far has not been a real problem. And we have chatbot, but it's easily really obvious when you're talking to a machine.
Yeah.
With the current generation of AI, the lines are very, very blurred.
Yeah, it gets particularly disturbing when you think of just the ability to learn from what does and doesn't work and what techniques work. I mean, I know there's call centers of scammers in various countries with playbooks, and they have meetings about what does and doesn't work, but it's still people with foreign accents, contacting people. So there's always a giveaway. In that sense. But once you start having AI making those phone calls or sending those emails or texts, it starts getting a little concerning of like how quickly can it learn to do bad things.
Exactly. I mean, I kind of saw it in person in a way, because I think it was last year, one of my listeners wrote to me and said, I'm working at a company, a startup, which works on synthesizing, deepfaking voices. And he wrote to me, can I, train my machine on your voice? Because, I've got hundreds and hundreds of great audio. Can I train my machine on your voice? I said, yeah, sure, go ahead. That's amazing. And he did. And he sent me like 60 seconds of me narrating a text. I mean, me, the machine, narrating in my voice. And although it wasn't as good as what you can see today, and let's say it won't fool anybody yet, you see that we're so close. I mean, at certain points, I said to myself, wow, I mean, I could use it on Malicious Life within a year or two. I could use it on Malicious Life to narrate an episode or part of an episode. And I'm not sure the listeners will be aware that there's a machine narrating my voice. So think about it. Somebody can do the same with my voice, calling, my mother or something. I need money. Give me money or something like that. The technology is there, and that scam will work because nobody can imitate my voice as well as a machine. That's pretty darn scary.
I think that what potentially helps us prevent that in some sense is how well we know people. That, it's one thing for you to be able to have a deep fake narrate something that you've written. And so it's not actually, so it's not that the AI has written the content and written the episode. It's still you who's written the content in the episode. So I think hopefully that still remains true with our interactions with people, as we can kind of know, well, that's off, Ran would never say that in that way. It sounds like wrong. Him, but he would never use that expression. He would never communicate in that form. And hopefully it's a lot longer before AI figures that out.
I don't have great hopes. I think once they really zoom in on a person, maybe it be myself, somebody else, they can really, really learn the way we speak, their habits. It's relatively easy, especially when somebody is very present in the internet. You've got Instagram and Twitter and Facebook. You can learn about someone automatically a lot if you just, scrape the right websites. When that happens, I think we'll have lots of episodes that we can make, both our podcasts.
Yes.
No danger of that running out.
I'll prognosticate that the first major case will be a politician.
Interesting. Although, when there's a deep fake of Biden or Putin or whatever, there's like 100, security experts or deep fake experts going over each and every bit, seeing that everything, looking for the signs, the telltale signs of fakes.
Yeah.
When it's me, I don't think somebody, maybe one of the listeners would be nice and check things out, but nobody, I think, is going to really think about or care about the ordinary people. Yeah. And these people are going to get scammed a lot by AI if nobody takes care. Maybe the only way to solve that is using an AI to fight the scamming AI. An AI that kind of noticed, there's something wrong about that voice. It's not totally human, something like that. That's really science fiction-y stuff.
Maybe we start having Blade Runner-esque interviews with each other at the beginning of our conversations.
Yeah. How did he call it? The void conf machine? Yep, you have to do me the void conf test before we interview, just to see that I'm a real human being.
So you're walking through a desert and there's a turtle and you turn it over on its back.
Exactly.
I hope our conversations don't go that way. It was too disturbing.
We live in interesting times.
That we do. So you've done a lot of interviews and you've written a lot of stories. What are some of the lessons that you've learned as kind of some of the themes and takeaways that people, the regular people, us, should be applying in our own lives to kind of mitigate? Obviously, we can't, prevent Equifax from being hacked, but there's things that we can do in our own lives to mitigate what happens if Equifax gets hacked. Mm-hmm. What are some of the things that you think we should be doing?
First thing I've learned is never to trust an organization with my data. I've researched and I wrote about and I told so many stories about organizations being hacked that I feel like I can no longer trust anyone, which kind of makes, everybody's lives on the internet a lot more miserable, because then you have to use different passwords for everything. And think about, ever since I started writing about cybersecurity, I never answer, the kinds of security questions that people, what's your spouse's name or your first dog or whatever. Nor do I give my real birth date or my kid's real birth. I've gotten a lot more paranoid over the years. And I think that's good paranoia, because back before then, like almost everybody else, I used to, reuse passwords, use memorable passwords, and working on a book and the show really made me become more cynical in a sense.
Yeah.
It's pretty obvious that we can't really trust any organization, whether it be government or from the largest companies to the small ones. Nor do we have to trust them. I mean, they're not our friends. Our data is their livelihood. So we need to really think about what we share online. Yeah. And it also, it's less fun being online when you're always on the lookout for stuff like that.
Yeah.
I don't share too much I stop sharing too much of my own personal life online, just because of what we talked about people can really scrape those sites and get a good sense of who I am, where do I live, who's my family, all my, all the blind spots that everybody has in their lives. So I'm much more careful now when I'm online than I ever was before. And it's a bit of a shame, back in the early 90s, 2000s, life was fun. I mean, you could catch a virus and it would maybe, I don't know, mess with your hard drive. But if you had a good backup, then okay, everything is fine. Now with ransomware and those hacks that expose your data to the world, it's not fun anymore. When you when you start really digging deep, you become paranoid in a sense. So, yeah.
Healthy paranoia.
Yeah. Ignorance is bliss for some people. They don't understand. They don't know the dangers. Sometimes they're lucky. Nothing happens. I know, my mother, she probably has no clue about how to handle herself online. Luckily, she's an Israeli. She's an old woman. So not like in the States. I know that in the States, you get scam calls a lot.
Yeah. So
that's a really frequent thing. In other countries around the world, non-English speaking countries, that's not that much of a big deal. It will be in not so far future. But so far, people like my mother, they don't see the dangers too much, because really life is not that dangerous. But for someone like me, whose online life is really revolves around all the usual suspects, Facebook, Twitter, I'm everywhere and where everybody is. For us people, we can't be ignorant. Being ignorant is inviting somebody to scam you.
Yeah, and I think it's one thing to say I'm going to avoid companies that I believe are intentionally trying to do, use my data. It's easy to say, to paint Facebook as a villain and say, well, they just exist to vacuum up data and sell it and market it and match it. But it's, we even need to be cautious of what information am I giving the grocery store? Their intent may be a little bit different, but a breach is a breach, and
exactly.
It starts getting merged with other data that we don't want out there.
Exactly.
It becomes a little more complicated.
Yeah, I'm not one of those people who think that Facebook is evil in a sense. I don't see evilness in corporations. The way I see it, and from my experience, corporations have culture, they have processes, they have people. They don't have emotions. People are, the corporate itself is a machine.
Yeah.
So I don't think Facebook is evil. That's what they do. They take your data, but nobody cares about, if it's Ran or Chris or whatever. Yeah. They don't usually care that much. But the scammers are using organizations like Facebook and others to help them gather the data that they do need in order to scam you. Yeah. And we leave lots of traces behind us online. And once you realize that, you can't really keep browsing the web as you did before. Now you become much more cautious.
Yeah. Yeah. And even offline, I'm a lot more cautious about things. That anytime I'm going somewhere and they have a form to fill out for whatever reason, it's like, why do you need, like, I can understand why you need this or that piece of information, but I don't see why you need that.
Exactly.
And I think most of us, at least, sheep is not the right word, but if a form is in front of us, we just fill out the form because that's what we've been programmed to do.
Yeah. What's the harm?
We don't think about asking. We don't think about asking the person who gave us the form, hey, do I really need to fill out all of this, or can I just fill out my name and address? And often they'll just say, oh, all we really need is your name and address. We don't need anything else. And so it's figuring out what is what information do we really need to disclose and to whom and when, and what we don't need to, and pushing back a little bit about data collection.
Exactly. Something that we need to do in the modern society, probably. We have no chance.
Yeah. And as time goes by, there'll be, unfortunately, probably less and less fields that are voluntary and more that are mandatory. But I think some companies are starting to get smarter about understanding that users don't always want to disclose a bunch of information if I want to join your website or join your forum, I should just be able to provide an email address and a password. That you shouldn't have to know a bunch of other stuff about me. And I think some companies are starting to get better at, hey, let's only ask really what we need in order to perform our function. And we don't need anything more than that to do what we need to do. Correct.
I mean, I think that for many companies, data is a liability. Having your customers' data that you need to keep it once in like 10, 15 years ago, you could store whatever information you wanted. And if there was a breach, well, there was a breach, we couldn't do anything. Now you can be sued to oblivion, basically. And regulators like in Europe and in the States are much more on top of how companies store data, what are they allowed to do with data. So now data becomes a liability. Mm-hmm. And myself personally, in my business, I try to keep as little information, as less information that I possibly can about users. I don't, oftentimes with people who like subscribe or pay or something, I just keep their emails, not even their names, because I know that I can get hacked somehow. If somebody really wants to target my company, they'll hack me. There's nothing I can really do about it. So it's like not keeping a gun in your house if you don't need to. For me, it's the same kind of feeling. If you need a gun, okay, keep it, store it in like a safe place. But if you don't need a gun, that's a liability, because then a kid could find it somewhere. Lots of disasters. Data starts becoming the same.
I had a great conversation with one of the guys at EFF, the Electronic Frontier Foundation. I always call it something different, but Electronic Frontier Foundation. Mm-hmm. And I really did. I think there was a point in that conversation that I really switched over to thinking of data is a liability. I've always tried to not collect stuff that I don't need, but I didn't think of it as a liability. And so one of the things that I started doing is I stopped retaining website logs. That I'll keep them for a certain amount of time for diagnostic purposes, but then stuff just auto deletes after a certain period of time where it becomes not useful for diagnosis. Just one less thing that I have that can be, that can either be hacked, or law enforcement comes along and says, hey, we want these logs and we want to know this about your users. Well, if I don't have that information, then that's just less of a liability for me.
Exactly. I don't envy the security guys in companies like Google and Facebook and stuff. I mean, there's so much information that can be stolen. That's really scary to be in charge of so much data in those companies.
And really having to figure out who and what should or shouldn't have access to what data. That starts to get the larger the organization, the more complex that becomes of, should your receptionist, your medical billing assistant be able to access patient history. Well, they need enough to be able to
Exactly.
do the billing, but can you anonymize it so they don't know who the individual is? Like, you start worrying about like how much.
Yeah. And when you think about it, in every modern company, information is the lifeblood of the company. A company in the most basic sense is a bunch of people processing information usually, or, processing physical goods, but they do need to process information as well, even for that, between different people, different functions in the company. So once you start needing to sequester that information, to ask yourself who needs information where, who doesn't need that kind of information, that really makes life much more difficult for a company to function correctly, because then all the time you're messing around with authorizations and who has access to that information, who doesn't have access. It makes life much more difficult once you have lots and lots of data, even for companies who are not like Facebook and Google.
Yeah.
Even for companies like myself, small companies, relatively small companies, I don't give access to information to all the employees of the company to the same kind of access, which means that I spend some part of my time, giving access, removing access, and it makes life much more difficult nowadays.
Your new hire receptionist should not have access to HR data.
Exactly.
But back in the old days, everybody had access to everything and would be peeking around on the company folders to see what's Sally making. Can I figure that out?
Yeah, actually, my first day, when I was electronics engineer in a company in Israel. I started my first day on a job. I was still a student, and as a very curious computer guy, the first day, I didn't have any real tasks to do yet. It was my first day, so I started, browsing the network to see which computers are connected, where are the servers, just to get a sense of everything. And at some point, I did something. I probably got into a server which I shouldn't have gotten to for somewhere. And I somehow, every employee in the company, something like 5,000 people, got a message on the screen from me saying something like a test, or something like that.
Oh.
and I was sure I'm going to be fired. But no, they never discovered who it was. If they did, they never told me. But nowadays, I wouldn't be able to do that. I wouldn't be able to reach some part of the network which I had no access to.
Hopefully you can't. Hopefully. Well, as we wrap up here, where can people find your podcast? Where can people find more about you online? Not that there's snooping, but the stuff that you want people to know.
Yeah, sure. So Malicious Life, the website is malicious.life. And they can also find me personally on Twitter, Ran Levi, RANLEVI. That's my handle. And I also have a personal blog. Most of it is in Hebrew, but there are some articles that I write in English as well. That's ranlevi.co.il. More like philosophical stuff, scientific musings and stuff I write about. And that's it, I think.
That's awesome. Ran, thank you so much for coming on the Easy Pray podcast today.
It was a pleasure, Chris. Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Easy Pray podcast. If you found something in this episode insightful, please leave a review at easypray.com/review. Notes and a transcript of this episode with Ran Levi can be found at easypray.com/124.